Good afternoon, everyone. How y'all doing? Good. So did everybody make it to the keynote? Or at least watch it from your room, maybe? If you're a little too tired from the training for the past 2 days? Well, hopefully you did, because there was one thing that I was kind of surprised to hear about this morning. So we'll discuss it later in the talk. But welcome to building a modern DevOps solution for your app. My name is Brian Randell. I'm a partner with MCW Technologies. A little more about me. We're a small consulting company focused mainly on the Microsoft stack, but I love managed code, so the fact that Xamarin does managed code makes me a happy bunny, and so I like playing with their tools also. I'm a Microsoft MVP that focuses on Visual Studio ALM, which means I spend a lot of time with Microsoft's products around helping teams build better software solutions by improving their interactions, the way they build software, help them adopt agile practices, and particularly I focus always on the latest tools from Microsoft to help people get up to speed. In doing that, I do training both in person as well as for Pluralsight Online. I have a course that I'm in the process of finishing on Visual Studio Online, which is Microsoft's TFS in the cloud. And finally, I was crazy enough to co-author a book this last winter with a couple of buddies that if you were to buy a copy, I'd probably get a couple quarters, so put that in mind. Put my kids through college, haha. Email address, Twitter handle, blog address. I will be available for questions after the talk. I'll be hanging around, going to the aquarium tonight, and I'll be here off and on during the day tomorrow, but feel free to ask me questions, shout me out at Twitter, etc. Don't send me your enterprise architecture plan and tell me, does this work? We can always work out a PO for that. But in either case, what are we going to go through here? Well, people tend to like to get slides, and I'm also going to reference a lot of things. This is an abstract track and talk in that I'm not going to focus on a lot of specifics as far as tools. I am going to talk about interactions, people, and how we do things. And I will reference other talks, videos you can watch, as well as articles to read. So what I've done is I've created a short link, and up on GitHub, I've got a repo up there. There's a couple links in there right now, but I'm going to add some more later today. So if you take that short link down, I'll put it up again, and you can get a copy of the slides as well as the links, because there will be homework. And I'll expect next year to see you back here, and I will find out if you actually paid attention. Now, who are you? I see a nice mix in the audience. I see a heavy propensity of Apple devices, but I see the Surface. I see a Sony Vaio and some other machines out there. So I think we have a mixed audience. But I wonder, do you ever feel like this? Or like that? Or maybe you're on the end of this. Someone yelling at you. Why is the server not up? Why can't my app connect? Why won't it download on my phone? Right? And do you ever feel this way about your hardware? Right? Well, fundamentally, these problems that we run into are all systematic of a lack in proper process for managing the complexity of the modern software development world. Probably the biggest thing that we have to realize today is that the world runs on software, and as such, that means that every company is a software company. Now, your core line of business, which you collect revenues on, might not be through the sale of software, right? I imagine because you're in the enterprise track, et cetera, and then we're at a Xamarin show, you're concerned with mobile apps on phones, tablets, et cetera, as well as probably still, there's the oddball PC app still out there, surprisingly enough, in corporate America. But those things, if you could not produce new versions, or if all your hardware stopped working, how many of your companies could function? How many of you could do business? Just a couple days ago, Delta had a little problem. Anybody run into this little problem? Trying to get in here to Atlanta? They lost their connection to the internet backbone. They lost their connection. They had to issue paper tickets for a few hours. A few people missed their flights, right? We're so used to walking in and checking in with our phones, right? Going to the kiosk, right? And companies have reduced manpower to adapt to that. So software at every organization out there is critical to the success of that business. And that means we have to start rethinking the way we build and manage and monitor software in enterprises, right? A lot of what I'm going to talk about has come out of the startup community and has come out of the smaller, what we like to call ISVs, the smaller software companies, people that are focused on software and technology, where they've bought into the world of agility and rethinking how we interact with the people in our organization to improve and deliver better solutions more effectively. So what we really want to do is think about how we can become more agile in not just the development of the code, but the handing off the code to some production system and then making sure that we have a closed feedback loop so we find out about issues and problems as well as proper usage of our app as soon as possible. Because I'm sure some of you work on a development team and you're faced with the problem of looking at the features of your backlog and wondering what's most important. How many of you work in a shop where what's most important is whatever the loud manager wants? Anybody have that? Yeah. Where the guy or the lady who just really is the most cantankerous is the one you try and just, if you can keep them from bugging you, you're happy. And so what you tend to do is try and get their features done. Wouldn't it be great if you had data to tell you what to build, right? Something that's a little less emotional. Well, that's what modern DevOps is all about. So when we think about what DevOps is, right, it's about thinking about that full lifecycle investment in our software development processes. Now, ALM as an industry term stands for Application Lifecycle Management. And a common thought process behind ALM is that it has three pillars: governance, development, and operations, or production. And the idea with ALM is that we think about software from inception, that idea that we're going to build some kind of software solution till the point that that solution is no longer being used. Now, a lot of software solutions today interact with larger systems. For example, Boeing. Boeing is not a software manufacturer. However, their newest airliner, the 787, cannot function without software. And having worked with a gentleman who managed the Team Foundation server at Boeing, right, they have a large development practice focused on developing the software Boeing needs to run their software, but also the software that goes into their core product, aircraft. And so when we're thinking about that larger picture, we're thinking about how those things fit together. And then what we found is that, just like in the traditional barriers and setup in a lot of organizations where we have different managers with different teams working in somewhat isolation, like dev and test, we've found that separating development from operations doesn't make sense. Now, it does mean that we're going to have these pieces on the side that are very specialized that don't interact a lot. For example, the guy that actually goes and physically sets up the server racks doesn't necessarily need to have a good relationship with the developer that's sitting there working on C# async patterns to make your app more responsive. Okay? But we start to get to a point where we start thinking about people that are responsible for quality, people that are responsible for getting the bits from the developers into a compiled form and distributed, whether it's published onto a server or up to an app store, may need to deal with the people that monitor and manage production servers and services, right? Because there's very few apps that work really great in airplane mode. Have you found that? Have you found out how often you sit there with an application and it's like, oh, I don't have internet. Sucks. I can't do anything. Right? Yeah, we do smart things like offline caching, et cetera, but we're kind of addicted to that notion of connectivity. And we're talking about devices, right? The devices make up for their lack of overall power in things like screen real estate and storage by having access to things like the cloud, to your internal servers and services that can store terabytes of data, that can do lots of calculations per second, more than your phone can do, and then bring back the results. So we think about it as this lifecycle investment where we're going to create teams that cross the traditional boundaries. And what we're going to do is hopefully enable us to deliver these products at a more rapid pace. DevOps is all about accelerating that last mile of continuous delivery. Continuous delivery starts from developers getting out of the manual configuration mode and getting into the concept of checking in and doing things like automated builds. And then taking that output and not then going and saying, okay, here's the script, go copy the files over to the server, now go configure the web server this way, make sure you run this database update script, and now you can test the app. right? We want to keep getting rid of those impediments and start pushing things out in an automated fashion. And we think about all the things that are driving this, right? A lot of this, like I said, is being driven from development from the standpoint that people have bought into Agile. And I don't like to get religious about a particular type of Agile, right? And I'll even go with the fact that, people who say they do Scrum but, as long as you're trying to improve, that's a good thing, right? And the data that we get from customer after customer and from the studies that are published by people like Gartner and Forrester is that Agile is working. We are seeing decreased time to market, and we are seeing increases in quality by moving to Agile. I will talk about Scrum for just a second at this point because Scrum's made significant inroads in organizations. And one of the things that Scrum does well is it breaks down the barrier between developers and testers. It's all about reducing that cycle time between when I finish a piece of code as a developer and I hand it off for someone else to look at. Whether it's another dev or it's someone that has a traditional title of tester or quality assurance engineer, right? That's like custodial engineers, right? Let's have the title so I feel a little better, right? Because testers are all about breaking stuff, right? They just like to make a mess at the end of the day, right? So mess makers are just apropos title, in my opinion. But without testers, man, my code's gonna have bugs. And so what Scrum says is everybody's a development team member. And so it's that concept of saying, look, let's get less focused on titles and even necessarily what your core function is, and go back to the core responsibility, which is shipping great software solutions. And so we think about the development cycle getting more efficient. That means we end up to this point where we've finished a sprint. We've finished a milestone. We've just finished some work. We've delivered value. In Scrum, the problem is we have with it, it says, okay, at that point, it's not the Scrum team's problem. Right? It's up to the product owner and the customer to then get it into production and decide when they want to take it. And on one hand, that's good. Right? Let's see, I haven't checked my phone today, but let's take a look. Let's look at the App Store. Did I miss an update? Oh, sure enough, you can see, if you look closely, right, I've got 10 updates, right? So as a user, I have some control to take those updates. We're okay with that. But what's frustrating is when a developer gets something done and knows it's going to take 3 weeks before it gets from being signed off on into production in the hands of the customers who've been yelling for it, and when do they get that feedback loop, right? When do they find out about it? Right? So we really start thinking about automated release pipelines as much as possible. Yes, you might have quality gates. You might have places where someone does a sanity check and signs off. And in larger scale environments and enterprises, you may go to the point of having entire sets of servers in larger things, often referred to like pods, where you can do things like just virtual IP swaps and switch the whole thing over in a matter of seconds. Because you want to keep the things running and do a check on basically what is production hardware at an off time where you're not under peak load, and then flip it out. The nice thing, if you use the cloud, like with Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure, they make that easy with the click of a button. Swap out an entire set of virtual machines in a couple seconds. So we start looking all the way around here, and then this is that typical cycle. We write code, we throw it at the wall, we give it to production, they have it. Well then, how do we know when something bad happens, right? Is it when someone calls and yells at us on the phone, right? Or is it when our company's out of business, right? Now you can read the articles about companies that have failed because they didn't have proper practices for getting code into production. And they also didn't have proper monitoring mechanisms to know that when something bad was happening, to be able to shut it down and stop it from causing irreparable harm. So what we want to do is have the appropriate tools and technologies that allow us to monitor and know what's going on, and then get that feedback back over the wall. Right? One of the big problems is we have times where IT knows about a lot of things. But how often do we find out about it? We find out in some meeting after our boss's boss has gone to a meeting and gotten yelled at by the customer. They go and yell at operations and why didn't you tell us this? And they go, well, you guys never asked. You don't play nice with us. So we want to make this a cycle that is shorter and shorter and more effective. Now, here's the issue, right? I'm in the enterprise track, and so there was this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that they were thinking about people that work in large companies that have to deal with this, not what we tend to refer to as WebOps, which are these large-scale internet properties that have been doing DevOps in one way or another for a while, whether we call it that or not, which is this consistent iterative process where they push out updates on an aggressive basis. Updates to their main properties, to their services, and then ultimately pushing out, where applicable, to things like devices. And these are examples of what is possible because they do it or they die, right? Twitter. When was the last time you saw a fail whale, right? Twitter has done amazingly well. They've got their act together when it comes to scale. They do enormous amounts of load. Facebook, right? And whenever something bad happens, we hear about it. It makes the press. Oh, Facebook is down, right? The world's freaking out, okay? Or Twitter's down or whatever. Same thing with Xbox, right? You can't play your games, the geeks go crazy, right? I know my son wants to rip my head off. Daddy, fix it. I didn't write it, son, I'm sorry. Well, fix it, okay. So there's a scale here that we can look to as inspiration. But then there's this feeling for a lot of teams that you have no ops, right? Which is you're barely getting the code done. In fact, I blame things like this, right? Well, not my reminder, but the phone. Because now everybody has an idea for an app, and everybody wants to convince some other developer that they're going to build the next greatest solution. And so they're only focused on, I got to get this app done. And that's a big part of it, right? Doing is better than thinking. But do you ever think beyond the fact that, okay, I build this thing and now it's out there and people are buying it and my server falls over because I have one server that's handling my REST endpoint to provide the data that my app uses, my app that maybe is scraping data from another website behind the scenes. So it's this kind of eventual thing where we've got extremes there. Internet scale, completely doing things effectively the right way or they die, to the no-ops team that kind of, well, we're working it out and they're suffering. And then we have the enterprise. And enterprise is interesting because they spend a lot of money. They have large staffs. I'm currently working with a large company that has over 1,000 developers, right? I don't even know how many of the IT people are there that are responsible for all the servers and things. But 1,000 developers, right? That's just, when you have 1,000 people doing anything, that requires some organization. Microsoft has 3,000 developers and people focused on Visual Studio and Team Foundation Server, working together to deliver those products. Right? So there's obviously some inherent hierarchy and structure that goes on there. But even they realized they couldn't continue this, and this is what enterprises are finding. And the biggest problem with enterprises is the fact that we have cross-functional organizations. Our biggest impediment to successful DevOps is you and your other coworkers, your managers, your organizations that will not give up their fiefdoms and will not communicate effectively to solve problems. So when we think about building an effective DevOps solution, a great talk that was given by the folks at Flickr back at its 2009's Velocity comes to mind. 10 plus deploys a day. So I'm curious, who deploys every day right now? Anybody in here? One, awesome. I'm sorry? So the gentleman's response was, it depends on the project, but yes, they can deploy once a day if they wanted to, all right? Anybody else happy they could deploy once a week? Once a month? Booyah, we won't even go any further. And the rest of you are like, quit asking me questions. I'm not going to answer. Well, the idea behind this is that they sat down and thought, how can we make Flickr better? So back in 2009, like I said, I will give it, the link is up on my GitHub repository right now, and you can watch it. I highly recommend it. A warning, there's one of the speakers has a bit of a foul mouth occasionally. But it's a great talk because it's all about concepts. They don't get into the tools as much because they know everybody had different tools, and not everybody's going to do what Flickr does. But when I went through the talk, there were some major points they made. And the first one is automated infrastructure, right? Now, you might wonder, some of you might just be a developer. You're just one person on your team. And maybe you're in this room because you didn't want to get up and go to another talk. Fine. Thanks for staying. You may wonder, it's not my problem to be DevOps. That's okay, but you can do something even on your own. And it starts with learning how your production environment gets stuff done. How do they automate? So if you're in a Windows shop, that might be things like PowerShell. If you use Linux or other environments, it may be something like Chef or Puppet. The key thing is, anytime you start thinking about, I'm building something new that has to be deployed, Start collecting everything you know about that deployment into some written form, and then translate that into some automated script, okay? I generally encourage developers to not sit down with your favorite top-level language like C# or something. Because what will happen is you'll just start getting into the weeds of coding, right? And don't even obsess about making the code super cool and reusable and really awesome and structured. Yes, follow some best practices if you've never used that environment, like, say, Chef, right? There's things to learn on how to create a cookbook in Chef parlance, or in PowerShell how to create a good run book so it'll run in things like SMA and Orchestrator. But fundamentally, what I'm getting at is you need to start thinking at your point how to translate what your app needs into an automated format. You can't hand the script of needs over to IT and expect them to do it, because what happens? They tend to be understaffed and they don't always know how to do it right. Right? And there's nothing worse that you hand them a long document, and if they screw one thing up, the whole thing doesn't work. Because guess what happens? They're going to call and they're going to yell at you and say, come fix this. So the step one is always think automated. Now, there is a friction point here. There is this weird little thing that occurs in some people's minds. Well, if I automate it, they won't need me. And you see that more on the IT side, but be aware of that. That is a thing you can encounter, some resistance, right, from people who don't want to do this because they want to keep their job. But when you want to hit internet scale and you want to have thousands of servers, you don't update them by hand. Now, the next thing is most interesting to IT pros. If you're a developer and you're not using version control, I really want to not talk to you, right? It's 2014. There's no excuse. And you can't even use cost as an excuse, right? There are great free version control products out there. And you can go old school centralized, or you can use the latest, coolest things that all the hip kids are using, distributed version control. The key is to use it. And the next thing is to encourage your IT pro friends, and yes, that's a word I want you to use with them, your IT pro friends to start using it also. Start setting up centralized locations to store all the interesting artifacts that help with your software solutions. Now that means, of course, things like specs and rules and configurations. But you want them to start documenting things like switches, IP routes, things that affect the network, firewall rules. You want all that stuff available. And yeah, use security where necessary. And don't check in things like passwords into scripts. But once again, you want to encourage them to start automating, which means if they start using Puppet, Chef, PowerShell DSC, they're going to have these assets that they have to version. Once again, I'm dealing with a customer. They're starting to use PowerShell extensively, and they're even using a product from Microsoft to help them with it. The problem is that product doesn't have a version control backing. It only has basically what's in draft and what's in production, right? So what I went through is I went through and grabbed their scripts, pulled them down, created a quick little local Git repo, and when I showed them, they're like, oh, that's cool. Right? Because what's great about Git, right, just a little location on your hard drive. And you don't have to do check-ins and checkouts. You can make changes. And text files, these PowerShell scripts aren't that long. They're easy to diff and see what's different. But we now will have this repository that then we'll put things in, and whenever we change it, we'll do it there, and then we'll push it up into this extra tool, which then is available through some other services. But getting your IT pros to think about version control is a big step forward. One step, build and deploy. All of you should be using some kind of collaborative build environment, right? With Team Foundation Server, it comes with something called Team Build, right? We have Jenkins, we have Hudson, and then you've got the OS 10 build features for working with Xcode and things like that. Fundamentally, the tools are out there, and most of them are free. It's mostly about just getting it set up and configured and then using it. Yeah, when you have a build server, there's some care and feeding that goes into it, but there's a lot of benefits that you get from making sure that you get away from the, well, it worked on my machine. Right? I was trying to get some code working last week, and it was one of those things where as soon as it went up to the build server, we found there's a problem because someone had done some messing around with the references and had got the NuGet packages out of whack, and so when it went to the build server, it couldn't restart correctly. And what that also meant is the other developer went to pull it to their machine, sure enough, it was broke for them. But those build servers help you find those problems right away. And then the next step is, let's not just build it in an automation fashion, let's deploy it in an automation fashion. I mean, the world of Windows is notorious, right? Okay, the big thing that people would do as developers, you build it and you create an installation program. And then you just hand that install and say, everybody go forth and deploy it. And the IT pros started getting the idea that when they had to do 10, 5, 20, 100, 1,000, I had a customer that has, you ready for this? Worldwide, 130,000 desktops. Guess what? You just don't make a quick bug fix with that many desktop applications, right? Now, this was in the late 90s, and they were definitely going to the web, right? But it's those type of things that make you rethink how you do it. Now, feature flags and branches, and this is probably one of the most interesting ones for developers in that it starts with rethinking how you build your application end to end. One of the things that made Flickr successful in their ability to have this DevOps culture was to be able to partition the application to bring online parts of it at a time. One reason they did it was for things like A/B testing, right? We think this is a great idea, but when you hit a certain scale, it's hard to get direct feedback from your users when your users number in millions, right? Because the biggest thing you find out is that they hate you, right? You look at any place there are comments, right? It's the gutter of the internet is commenting systems, right? So yes, you have a big customer, you might get something valuable. So one way to do it is through behavioral testing patterns where you give one set of customers a feature and you that same feature just probably another way. To do that, though, requires that you have end-to-end flow in your applications that understand the version A and the version B. Feature flags let you do things like let your professional users of your application try it out. Microsoft followed onto this, and with their Visual Studio Online cloud service, does this every day. As an MVP, I've signed up for what they like to call dog fooding, which means once they get a feature good enough to where it won't cause data loss, and it will actually work decently, I've signed on that they can turn on in my account. So I wake up some mornings and all of a sudden I find something new in front of me, right? There's a new feature. And what I have found that sometimes they give me a different version than someone else. And they definitely give me a different version than sometimes what makes it out to production for the rest of the world. And they move to a cycle that's every 3 weeks. They update the service about every 3 weeks. To get to that model, you can't be doing this big design up front. You can't lay down these huge features. You got to do them in smaller pieces, and that means your application end has to know that this feature is turned on here for this user, and the data can flow all the way through properly. That means thinking about your persistence story, where you keep your data, how it's made available through service layers, right? Because Visual Studio Online has both a web-based interface and a programmatic REST interface. All those things need to be taken into account. This also brings up how you do branching. One of the things that is a big issue with enterprises is how do they do concurrent development? The version control mechanism to solve this is branching. The problem is branches are like puppies. They need care and feeding, otherwise they do all sorts of bad things on your house. And what happens is with branches, with developers and using things like centralized version control, is there's a maintenance issue between moving data between them. This is where if people are mature enough as developers using tools like Git that allows private branches and lightweight branches can sometimes be more effective in this type of development model. And shared metrics is a big thing for Flickr. If IT knew something, aka ops, the dev team knew about it. No secrets. This is a big issue for a lot of enterprises, right? Developers don't get to really talk to IT folks. They go through ticketing systems. They make requests, and they wait for 3 days till it happens, right? Now, sometimes it's a manpower issue, and obviously there's this need in a lot of enterprises for traceability, who asked for what and who's spending what money. But we're talking about monitoring production applications. Shouldn't you know as the developer who wrote the code that something bad is happening? Absolutely. So you need things like shared dashboards and systems that will provide metrics in the language you speak, right? We need to be able to filter the data to know that this data has to do with the environment. We're out of disk space, we're running low on memory, we've got a hardware failure, versus looking at, oh, it's an exception in the developer's code. And last but not least, they couldn't stress this enough, communication. And probably the coolest thing was, right, you had the two people up on stage together, one from dev and one from ops, talking about how they made Flickr better. So when we think about these big things and going to DevOps, this is an unusual talk for me. Normally I'd be doing demos by now, and I apologize if you're looking for something really demo heavy. You don't buy DevOps off the shelf. I'll cut to the chase, by the way, on the solution here. If anyone starts selling you, we've got a DevOps solution, they're full of it. Because it first starts with the people, then your interactions, how you do things, and then finally, yeah, you can get software to help, right? But it's not a magic bullet. With people, it starts with breaking down the barriers. Like I said, about this customer around with over 1,000 devs. I report to the test manager of all people. So I'm working with his team to help them improve their DevOps process because they have a problem where their developers are actually quite mature. They're using Scrum-like practices. They have nice short cycles. But their problem is they cannot get code into a good test environment in less than 3 days. So on one hand, they're doing CI builds, right? But their smoke tests are very limited in what they can do. They can't get to full-scale automated tests because they lose this time from getting the code into these environments. Break down the organizations. Same problem. I'm like, well, can we just set up, we can set up Lab Manager. They use Team Foundation Server and stuff. They use a bunch of Microsoft products that I know. I'm like, can we do this? Oh, no, well, we can't do that because we're not using Hyper-V. We're using VMware. Okay, well, but Hyper-V is free, and you guys have the hardware. Yeah, but IT has said we're going to use VMware. It's like, well, can I talk to them? Oh, no. You got to ask so-and-so, talk to so-and-so, right? It's got to stop. There really needs to be this point where a huge part of IT in an organization is dev and ops together. Once again, you're going to have these fringe groups that are specialized, but there needs to be a much more flat organization. Yes, you're going to probably start with the virtual team. That's what I'm doing right now with every customer I have, even the ones that say they're doing DevOps before I even get there. They still have people reporting to different managers, but that's a good step. Don't let it get you down, but understand that that's not going to work in the long run. And ultimately try and move to these DevOps teams. You got to get buy-in from people, and the higher you can get this buy-in done up the chain, the more successful you'll be sooner. Now we get probably to the meat of what has to happen is, what things are we going to change? What are our interaction points? Just remember, at the end of the day, the whole point is to shorten these cycle times. So we want to look at all the delays that are occurring and break those down. The team I'm working on right now, there's 3 of us that are focused on DevOps, and we're doing different areas. Like right now, I'm focused on how we're going to get output from builds automatically deployed into virtual machines running up in Microsoft Azure. I've got experience there, so I'm focusing on that while someone else is working on some of their quality automation things. So find the places where you're taking the most time and start shortening those cycle times. And so we start thinking about looking at the core flow that is going to be the DevOps pipeline for your organization. You're going to have developers pushing in code into repositories. And we want those repositories available to everyone who needs to see them, dev and ops. When we get to the build portion, everything needs to be automated to get the inputs into position so that it can be deployed. Whether that's your phone apps, whether it's your services, whether it's your database change scripts, all of it has to come through an automated build process. You're going to need some kind of testing pipeline. Now, it might be a simple testing pipeline that has just some automated tests and someone takes a quick look, to a very formal multi-stage environment where you have a quality assurance department doing a bunch of manual tests. You might have a separate test lab that does performance and stress testing. And then ultimately, you might even have a UAT environment where your customers do user acceptance testing. But all those things have to happen, and then you can deploy, for example, locally and make your app available. And then you got to make sure that your app is set up to be monitored automatically and publish data to both operations and development. And the cool thing about this is when you start thinking about these pipelines, they extend to the next level, which is you can do the same thing to the cloud. And you might have pieces of this or all this in the cloud, right? The Xamarin test service, the test cloud. That's great. I mean, on some hand, the geeks in the audience are like, well, no, I'd love to have a full room of all these devices I could play with, right? But at the end of the day, it's not economical. So when you think about DevOps, it breaks down to a very simple mantra of a consistent, repeatable, automated process. So if we break down the areas where you can make changes, it starts with continuous integration. When you check in code, do you get a build? Do you have some automated process that does a sanity check for how you're doing? Continuous testing. Once again, I'll come back to Scrum. One of the great things we did with Scrum is that we sat down and said, let's break down the barriers within development, which was let's get testers next to developers. So I had a customer that was having this problem with just that. They couldn't get bugs tested or found effectively when they handed off code from development. What was happening? Well, testers were in a separate room, and they were shared across different teams. So you had 3 people in a different room working for this one dev team, working on 3 different dev projects. They would alternate through. So what we did was we said, okay, you work with this product team, you work with this product team, you work with this. We moved their offices. They sat right next to them, right? And their bug rate has gone down 25% in 3 months, right? Because they can now find things much faster than they did before. Because the testers are working side by side with the developers. They're a part of the development team. They're not just a part of the QA team. Continuous deployment, right? That means being able to take it at will and have it in a deployable unit, right? Very few of us get the chance to say file new and create a completely new software solution that doesn't do anything. We're often a part of something large that's already there. So the first step is to take our existing software and take away every possible inhibitor that stops it from being deployed with the click of a button, by a script, by some automated process. And then as you add new things, and this goes back to that theme for developers to sit there and go, all right, I need IS to have this. Write that down, add it to a list of requirements, and then go figure out the way to do it through PowerShell, for example, if you're using IIS. Get that into the process so you can make sure not only does the app deploy, but the dependencies are there and ready and going. Continuous feedback is another one. Making sure that you know what's going on with the users. Did they like the feature? Did that work? Is there a way for them to get it in there? Oh, he's going to change my remote. Okay. And he's in the wrong place. And so with continuous feedback, we're looking at making sure people have a way to get to do that. And we think about products. One of the things you can do is there's a product called User Voice out on the internet. You can sign up for it and use it as a way to grab information from your users and have it pushed into your development system and get it on your backlog, right? And it provides a way to do that two-way communication to know what's going on and what they like. I don't understand why he had to do that, but okay. This leads to ultimately continuous improvement. Never stop, willing to learn, and make it better. And at the end, if you can follow these C words, you can move to continuous value delivery. The ability to really make customers happy, delight them with what you've built, and make the world a better place. Now, when I start talking about this, people often say, well, what about app stores? App stores do create friction. And one of the friction points that you're going to run into is that you've got these phone apps, these tablet apps, et cetera, that aren't interesting if they don't have the back-end service. So once again, you've got to think about the app as a holistic item. So what you need to do is say, if I can't time the updates on a one-to-one microsecond, I'm going to have to design things a little differently. And probably the biggest thing you got to think about these days is versioning your services. Services have to be there for a long time, particularly if you're in the public app stores. Obviously, if you're in an enterprise store and you're delivering only to internal customers, you're not going to have as much friction there, right? Because you'll be able to make things available and even force people to do updates. When we think about versioning REST services, there's 3 common things. The problem that you'll find is that people will get into this position of, but it isn't RESTful enough if you do it that way. And so there's a great article that I'll give you from Troy Hunt that he talks about all 3 because he created this service earlier this year called Have I Been Pawned? And it basically goes through all the known internet security errors out there where people's usernames and passwords have been hacked. And you can type in your name and it'll go through. And he's basically made a website available as a service. And so he talks about these 3 solutions, and he ultimately came up with this, one way or another, I would run into a fight with people who wanted to get very focused on the semantics of REST. And what he said was, I want a solution that works and is flexible and is versionable. And you know what he's done? He does all 3. He supports all 3 in his application, and the article's totally worth reading. Even if you're not doing REST, it's worth reading because it talks about the notion of versioning services. So if you're doing SOAP, God forbid, WCF over the internet or whatever, but the bottom line is you need to think about how you version your resources. Now, when you think about databases, one of the biggest things I find with them is that people don't have proper rigor around them. They've been around for a long time, and there's people that are in control of them, whether they're what I call data architects or DBAs, and there's a big disconnect between what development needs and how those changes are taking place in the database. You need to get them in sync with your service architects and the people that build the services so that you can adapt to the different shapes that your application is going to want and has to get from the services that are ultimately persistent in your databases. And the other thing, as much as I'm a big fan of relational databases, is that you might want to start modernizing your data models. Start thinking about using different kinds of storage mechanisms, whether it be document databases or maybe doing large-scale storage systems like table storage that Azure has. We're building an application that we went through a test run, and originally we were building on top of SQL Server, and we found under some load testing, we figured we could handle between 90,000 and 180,000 concurrent users based upon our usage pattern. But our application goals, we need to support 10 million because we're building it for disasters. We can't do it there, but luckily the guys I'm working with, we've used Azure, and so we're using multiple storage accounts and storage tables in Azure that supports things like geo-replication and multiple data center entry points to achieve that type of scale. So sometimes it also means reevaluating how you built your application. So we finally get down to tools, and then I'm going to show you a demo of one tool that I think is really important, is we need all these different things. I live in the Microsoft space, so those are the products I know. But it's all about, these are the major things that you need to have available to you and your team. Version control, some kind of work tracking, assembling and packaging, so being able to automate the builds and automate the creation of your output binaries. Automated deployment tools. Monitoring and analytics is probably one of the most critical things. And so when I watched the keynote this morning, it was kind of funny to see them talk about analytics. Now, no, I'm not going to show you the new Xamarin analytics product because I don't have access to it. It was as much a surprise to me as everybody else. What I am going to show you is Preemptive Analytics product. Preemptive has been in the business since 2008 in this space working on application analytics. And in doing so, that means you get a platform that supports everything that people are using, obviously including Xamarin. But even things like native C++, all the major Microsoft.NET languages. And they've designed it to be flexible both for line of business applications, ISVs, or the latest startup. Supporting deployments in your corporate environment, outside, isolated remote, in VMs, outside, whatever you need. So I have the application deployed on my phone, and it's an Android phone. So you can guess why I probably didn't want to use the emulator, because the talk would be done at that point. So the app looks something like this. Oops, let me go back. And it's really simple. All it does is let you demo gathering data from the application. And one of the things you can do is capture feedback and preferences. In doing so, you can get a happiness factor. You can also find what their favorite color is. The whole point is think about data that you want to know is being used in your application that you can gather at a very granular level based upon user interaction. But it's not only limited to that, because sometimes you run into the dreaded, oops, I missed something. The handled exception, the unhandled exception, and the one that's just thrown from a different component. And so the application does all those things. Now, what I want to do is, sir, right here, will you volunteer for me for a second? Have we discussed this before? No. All right, so what we're going to do here is we're going to first look at, and if I knew how to use my phone, I'm wearing the wrong glasses here. Will you tell me what the identity says, what department it says there?
IT operations.
Okay, so it has a random generator that just generates a fake department, so you can know for different types of applications. And then what I'm going to do, sir, is I want you to, while you sit here, don't submit, but go ahead and set a happiness factor for me and pick a color. Okay, but don't hit submit. All right, you got a second, because what I'm going to do here is I'm going to switch over to the portal. Now, that's a screenshot in case I lost internet, but we're going to come over here, and I'm going to go to this workbench. Okay, no problem. These phones are just crazy. There we go. 1 second. Let's go to capture feedback right there. So go ahead and just slide and then tap, and you can do that. All right? So we said he was in operations. So if we come over here, can you tell me what the serial? No, you can't tell me. So we'll figure out the serial number, but we'll be able to get the exception count. We can look at the number of sessions that have been happened, key statistics about which pages they used, whether they profiled, what operating system, what phone version. I can look at critical activity, like service level, and then you see there's the happiness by day, and then we see the colors. So have you figured out what you're going to pick?
Yeah.
All right, you did your happiness factor. Go ahead and hit submit. Did it say submitted okay?
Yeah, it says feedback, accepted, thanks for submitting your feedback.
Fantastic. Now, sir, I'm going to let's go through. Which color did you pick?
Aqua.
All right, so if we look at aqua, right now it says 8. And what did you pick for your happiness value?
7.2.
7.2. So we're looking at some of there. So if I come over here and refresh this value, aqua is now 9. All right, and the happiness value, did we get a new entry there? It looks like it rounded up to 7. So this is a simple example of why you want analytics. And once again, it's great that Xamarin has done it. The one thing about the Xamarin solution, right, it's obviously focused on their platform and stuff. Microsoft's getting into the game. They have a new product called Application Insights. This is a hot market, so you have a lot of choices. The big issue that you have with a preemptive versus Xamarin and even Microsoft right now is they're both immature. We haven't used them yet. So you're going to be using them and helping them beta test. Microsoft has been an extensive test up to the point where I've had a little churn headache. I've said, I'm going to wait till you guys give me the new major version. But in either case, the whole point is to start thinking about how we can get the effective information about what our users want. And this is something that both the IT pros can use because these monitoring systems can tell you about the systems as well as the software solution you're working with. And then remember earlier I talked about that data. How do you know what features to put in your application? Things like this will help you determine your user base, when they use it, how often they use it. You want slides and links? You can find it up at bri.gd, BRXE, 14 content. Modern DevOps is not something you buy off the shelf. It's getting in line with your people first, making sure you've nailed down their interactions, and finally it is going and finding the effective tools that will fit your environment, your experience, and sadly, ultimately, your budget. Think about your mobile solutions holistically. Don't just focus on the phone as much as you think about all the things that go together, and be careful about considering which services you use for backend, whether it's from Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, etc. Make sure you have enough control and the ability to create a holistic solution for your organization. And ultimately, continue to evolve. Thank you very much and have a great rest of the show.